Pick that up, sweetheart. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 43 minutes before the Marine Sergeant Major arrived at Cedar Creek Medical and changed everything. Danielle Ross folds linens in the supply room with methodical precision, her hands moving like clockwork under the fluorescent lights that hum overhead. The antiseptic smell burns her nostrils as she smooths each corner with practiced efficiency, the kind of muscle memory that comes from 13 years doing this exact thing in hospitals across 3 continents. Her fingers pause briefly over a tarnished challenge coin buried deep in her scrubs pocket, a habit she doesn't realize she has developed. The coin is warm from her body heat. She traces its ridged edges once, then releases it. Her left forearm bears a jagged scar that runs from wrist to elbow, visible when her sleeve rides up during work. When she notices it exposed, she quickly rolls the fabric down, her jaw tightening slightly. Nobody at Cedar Creek Medical asks about scars. The hospital moves around her like a river around a stone. She charts vitals with hands that never shake, monitors her patient list with unusual attention, cross-references names against a mental database that only she maintains. The other nurses barely notice her. They don't remember conversations that happened 3 days ago, don't catch the way she watches certain pharmaceutical shipments, don't see the micro-expressions that cross her face when a particular name appears in the system. She prefers it this way. Invisibility is a tool. Invisibility is protection. Invisibility is survival. In the ICU at 7:48 a.m., she adjusts the ventilator settings on a post-operative patient, a routine check, nothing remarkable. Her movements are economical. Nothing wasted. She glances at the monitor displaying O2 saturation at 96%, heart rate stable at 72 beats per minute, blood pressure 120/80. All normal. All expected. She makes a note in the chart and moves to the next room. There are 4 patients on her silent list today. 3 of them are civilians. 1 is not. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, Chief of Surgery at Cedar Creek Medical, stands at the nurse's station watching her. He's 48 years old, wears a Tom Ford suit that costs more than some nurses' monthly rent, and has positioned himself as the hospital's most indispensable surgeon through a combination of genuine competence and ruthless elimination of rivals. His jawline is tight as he observes Danielle moving through the ICU with quiet efficiency. She doesn't fawn over him. Doesn't defer. Doesn't perform the grateful subordinate routine that everyone else instinctively adopts in his presence. She charts vitals like he isn't standing there. She adjusts medications like she isn't being observed. She exists in her own sphere, untouched by his gravitational pull, which makes his skin crawl. He taps his pen against a chart, a staccato rhythm that sounds like a countdown. The hierarchy at Cedar Creek Medical is carefully constructed. Whitfield sits at the apex. His reputation is built on being the indispensable expert, the surgeon the board calls when something goes wrong, the man who saved cases that should be lost. But lately, for 6 months now, he's noticed something wrong in the data. Mortality rates for his post-operative cases have ticked down slightly. Patient satisfaction has ticked up. The board members have started asking different questions. Fewer emergencies land on his desk. Fewer desperate families are pressing his hand and calling him a miracle worker. And somehow, a nursing staff that used to defer to his authority has begun making decisions without consulting him first. There's only one variable that changed. He decides something in that moment, watching her move with the precision of a machine. She needs to break. Or she needs to be gone. He isn't particular about which. The cafeteria at Cedar Creek Medical at 11:14 a.m. is crowded with hospital staff on their shifts, residents grabbing lunch between surgeries, nurses stealing 30 seconds to eat before returning to floors. Danielle carries her tray, grilled chicken, steamed vegetables, iced tea, to a corner table where she sits alone, the way she always does. She's cut the chicken into exact portions. Everything about her is precise. Everything is controlled. Whitfield enters the cafeteria like he owns it, because he essentially does. He's shaking hands with board members, laughing at a joke that doesn't land quite right, working the room like a politician. He sees Danielle. He changes direction. He walks directly toward her table. The conversations around them don't stop immediately, but they begin to slow, the way conversations do when predators enter spaces. He doesn't greet her. He doesn't speak. He simply bumps her tray with his hip as he passes, a gesture that looks almost accidental, the kind of thing a careless person might do while walking through a crowded room. But it isn't accidental. Danielle's tray tips. The chicken slides. The vegetables scatter across the tile floor like they're trying to escape. The iced tea spills, and the plastic cup bounces once, twice, then rolls to a stop at the feet of Dr. Patricia Gomez, the chief of nursing. The room does go dead silent. Not gradually. All at once. Rubber gloves stop snapping. Conversations freeze mid-word. 23 people stop eating and turn to watch. Whitfield's smile is perfection. 10-1 she walks by Friday. He says it loudly enough for the nearest tables to hear. He says it like he's announcing sports odds. Anyone want in on that bet? Come on, someone's got confidence, right? He looks at the gathered staff like he's invited them to a party. Just seems like the type. Doesn't have the resilience for this job. I give it a week, tops. Danielle is already moving. She doesn't speak. She doesn't make eye contact with any of the 23 people watching. She simply bends, collects the scattered vegetables, retrieves her cup, and carries the debris to the trash. Her jaw is clenched so tightly that someone watching carefully would see the muscle flex along her temples. But no one is watching carefully. They're watching Whitfield, who is basking in the attention like a predator satisfied by a successful hunt. He hasn't broken her, not yet. But he's sent a message. He's drawn blood in front of witnesses. He's made it social. The medication room at Cedar Creek Medical is small, climate-controlled, locked at all times except when authorized nursing staff are inside. Danielle enters at 1:19 p.m., after the lunch crowd has dispersed. She closes the door quietly. The lock clicks behind her. For a moment, there is no one watching her. No one observing. No one waiting for her to perform competence or accept humiliation with quiet grace. Her hands begin to tremble. It's not fear. She knows fear. She has lived in fear in a way that would break most people. This is something else. This is the trembling that comes from holding yourself together with pure will, from maintaining composure while your muscles want to move, want to act, want to respond. The trembling is restraint. The trembling is every bit of training that taught her that reaction equals exposure, that anger equals compromise, that any visible response to his provocation would be a confession she can't afford to make. She reaches into her scrubs pocket and grips the tarnished challenge coin. It's warm from her body. The ridges press into her palm like braille, like a message only she can read. The coin is from a Marine colonel in Fallujah, 2008, pressed into her hands at a field hospital after she'd held his shattered arm together while IED shrapnel filled the air like insects. "You're going to save people, Master Chief," he'd said, already delirious from morphine. "Real people. In real places. Don't ever forget what you're capable of." She doesn't forget. But sometimes, when she folds linens and charts vitals and watches specialists like Whitfield perform, she wonders if anyone remembers. Or if she's supposed to stay invisible forever. If this is the cost of the mission, 2 years of being underestimated, dismissed, overlooked, waiting for the moment when she can finally stop pretending. But not yet. Not while the operation is still active. Not while there are 3 names on her list that need monitoring. The trembling subsides. Her breathing returns to baseline. She releases the coin and exits the medication room, and by the time she reaches the ICU, there is nothing in her expression that reveals what just happened. Nothing that shows the cost of composure. Nothing that hints at the person underneath the nurse's uniform. By 3:22 p.m., Danielle is in the ICU hallway, charting a post-operative patient's recovery progress. She's standing at the counter, pen moving across the chart with the same methodical precision she brings to everything, each line formed exactly, each notation clear, each entry a perfect representation of clinical observation. She's aware of Whitfield's presence before she hears him. There's a change in the air pressure, the way the space compresses when a predator enters a room where prey exists. He doesn't speak. He simply drops a patient chart on the floor beside her feet. Not accidentally. Deliberately. The chart lands with a sharp slap against the tile, and papers scatter in a small explosion of white. Vital signs. Lab results. Medication logs. All spreading across the floor like something broken. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Whitfield says, and his voice carries the specific tone of a man who knows exactly what he's doing. An ICU nurse named Marcus Webb is at the other end of the hallway. A resident named Dr. Sarah Chen is walking past. 2 orderlies are within earshot. He's done the math. He knows who will see this. He knows who will tell others. He's building a narrative, piece by piece. Danielle doesn't flinch. She doesn't blush. She doesn't show anger or humiliation or any of the emotions that Whitfield is trying to elicit. She simply sets down her pen, bends, and begins collecting the papers. Her hands move with mechanical efficiency. Chart sections. Lab reports. Medication logs. All gathered into her hands with the careful precision of someone assembling something fragile. She collects every piece. She stands. She taps the papers against her leg to align them. She sets the chart back on the counter, all without speaking, without acknowledgement, without giving him the smallest satisfaction of a reaction. It was then that the waiting room doors burst open, and what happened next didn't just change everything, it ended his certainty that he understood the power dynamics in his own hospital. A stretcher moved through the entrance at 3:28 p.m., and the paramedics calling into the radio used the tone reserved for critical patients. GSW to the abdomen, entrance wound right of umbilicus, no exit wound, lost consciousness twice en route, last BP 118/60 and dropping, ETA trauma bay 2 minutes, incoming code yellow. But the patient on that stretcher wore a dress Marine uniform. And the rank on his collar read Sergeant Major. And the way the emergency department staff suddenly moved with a specific kind of urgency, the kind reserved for VIPs and high-value patients, told Danielle everything she needed to know about what was about to happen. Because she knew this Sergeant Major. Not personally. But she knew his unit. She knew his command structure. And when the Navy combat medic who arrived with him, a young sailor named Devon Parrish, tattooed and exhausted, made brief eye contact with her while pushing the stretcher toward Trauma Bay 2, his eyes widened in a way that suggested he recognized something impossible. She'd sutured that young man's laceration once, in a field hospital in Baghdad, 7 years ago, with rounds impacting the walls and the smell of diesel fuel mixing with blood and her hand steady as a surgical laser even as mortar fire shook the foundation. He'd been a junior enlisted then, barely 22, watching her hands move with the kind of precision that only came from training he couldn't imagine. He was looking at her now with the realization spreading across his face like a sunrise. The morning rounds at Cedar Creek Medical began like every other morning, fluorescent lights humming their sterile song, the antiseptic smell layering over coffee and something vaguely like fear. Danielle Ross moved through the ICU with methodical precision, her tablet tucked against her ribs, eyes fixed on vital signs and medication times that meant absolutely nothing to the man now standing directly in her path. Dr. Marcus Whitfield didn't move. He simply waited, blocking the nurse's station while 6 staff members pretended not to watch, their attention suddenly very focused on computers and clipboards and anything except the scene about to unfold. Ross. His voice carried across the station like a bell. "I've been reviewing your performance metrics." Danielle stopped. She didn't look up. Her fingers continued moving across the tablet screen, entering an order for Mr. Henderson in room 412, her hand steady as surgical steel. "Mediocre at best," Whitfield continued, his tone the kind of casual cruelty that only works when witnesses are present. "Tell me something. Did you actually finish nursing school, or did they just need to fill quotas?" The question hung in the suddenly too quiet station. A monitor beeped. Someone's badge clinked against a desk. Danielle's jaw clenched, not the visible kind that made heads turn, but the microscopic tightening that only someone trained to read human behavior would catch. She continued entering orders. Her voice, when it came, was level as a horizon line. "I completed my training, Dr. Whitfield." He leaned closer. She could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressively masculine, the scent of a man who'd never understood that real power doesn't need to announce itself. "That's a cert when you address me, sweetheart." His smile was the kind of smile that made people uncomfortable without knowing why. "Let's establish that now, shall we?" Danielle met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Her gaze was flat, unreadable, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse than this. Then she returned her attention to the tablet, her fingers resuming their work without pause or hesitation. She didn't acknowledge his demand. She didn't argue. She simply continued. Whitfield's smile tightened. That wasn't the response he'd anticipated. She was supposed to flush, to stammer an apology, to give him the satisfaction of her discomfort. Instead, she was treating him like a minor interruption in her day. The 6 staff members had gone completely still, waiting to see what he'd do next. He did what men like him always do, he escalated. "Your charting is sloppy too," he added, his voice rising slightly, aware now that his audience was fully present. "I've had to correct your assessments twice this week alone. Perhaps you need a refresher on basic documentation standards." Danielle's fingers paused for the briefest moment. Then they resumed their work. "The assessments were accurate," she said quietly. "You can verify them in the system." The casualness of the statement, not defensive, not angry, just factual, seemed to infuriate him more than any confrontation could have. He turned away abruptly, his white coat snapping like a sail, but not before everyone at the nurses' station understood what had just happened. Dr. Whitfield had attempted to break something and failed to leave a mark. Danielle continued her rounds. She didn't look at the other nurses. She didn't acknowledge the small nod of support from Janet, the charge nurse. She simply moved forward into the next patient room, her external composure a perfect mask over the calculation happening behind her eyes. This was escalating. Whitfield had moved from simple mockery to public confrontation, from social humiliation to strategic positioning. He was building a narrative now, documenting a pattern of incompetence that he could point to later. She understood the play. She'd learned it in rooms much darker than this, from people far more dangerous than an ambitious surgeon with a god complex. She'd learned to recognize when someone was laying groundwork, building a case, preparing witnesses. The difference was that those people had usually been trying to kill her, and Whitfield was only trying to humiliate her. The margin of difference felt significant. By that afternoon, the cafeteria incident had become legend. Danielle sat alone at a corner table, her habit, her preference, her tactical advantage. She could see 3 exits from that position. Her back was against a wall. No one could approach from behind. Dr. Whitfield entered with 3 residents in tow, his timing too perfect to be accidental. He must have waited for his moment, for the lunch rush to peak, for maximum visibility. He approached her table with the confidence of a man who'd never experienced real consequences. "Folks, I want you all to witness something," he announced, his voice pitched to Carrie. "I'm making a bet here. I give Nurse Ross, let's call her G.I. Jane since she seems to think she's some kind of tactical genius, exactly 1 week before she quits this job." One of the residents laughed nervously. The other 2 exchanged glances. Around the cafeteria, heads turned. Danielle kept eating, her fork moving with mechanical precision, her expression utterly absent of emotion. "Any takers on that bet?" Whitfield leaned against her table, his presence the physical embodiment of superiority. "Who wants to put money on how long G.I. Jane lasts?" Danielle didn't respond. She didn't acknowledge him. She simply cut a piece of chicken breast and put it in her mouth and chewed. The action was so completely normal, so utterly uninterested in his existence, that it seemed to anger him more than any response could have. He knocked her tray off the table. The motion was sudden and violent, his elbow connecting with the ceramic plate in one sharp movement. Her lunch crashed to the floor in an explosion of red tomato soup and white ceramic and scattered vegetables. Soup splattered across the white tile, spreading in a thick stain that looked far too much like blood. The cafeteria went silent. "Oops," Whitfield said. He was smiling. "Better clean that up, G.I. Jane. It's what you're good at." Laughter scattered through the room like broken glass. A few polite chuckles. Someone's nervous energy finding an outlet. Danielle set down her fork with deliberate care. She stood. Her chair scraped against the tile with a sound like a knife being drawn. She looked directly at Whitfield for 3 full seconds, not in anger, not in fear, but with the exact expression someone might wear while observing an insect they'd already decided wasn't worth crushing. Then she turned and walked to get napkins. She knelt in the spreading soup puddle, her scrubs darkening where they touched the wet floor. She wiped in silence while conversations resumed around her like water closing over a stone. The other diners returned to their meals, their brief moment of entertainment passing. She was erased. Whitfield had already moved on to his residence, already forgotten about her, already moved on to the next audience, the next performance. But Danielle knew better. This wasn't forgotten. This was being catalogued, preserved, weaponized. He was building documentation. He was turning her composure into evidence of her unsuitability for the job. A normal person would have reacted. A normal person would have cried or fought back or quit. A normal person would have given him the satisfaction he was desperate for. Instead, she simply cleaned up her lunch and returned to work. That evening, the ICU hallway was nearly empty, that strange quiet hour between shift changes when the hospital held its breath. Danielle was walking toward the medication room, her tablet updated with the latest lab results, when Whitfield stepped out of the supply alcove directly into her path. He threw a patient chart at her feet. Not dropped. Threw. The paper scattered across the tile with the violent hiss of cascading documents. "Pick that up, sweetheart." His voice was sharp as broken glass. "And get Mr. Henderson's labs redone. You obviously drew them wrong the first time." The lab results were perfect. They both knew it. She'd drawn them with the precision of someone who'd spent years extracting blood samples from patients in field conditions where sterile technique meant the difference between infection and survival. The numbers were clean, the samples untainted, the results ironclad. But Whitfield didn't care about perfect. He cared about control. He cared about making her bend. Danielle bent. She knelt in the hallway and collected the scattered pages, her movements calm and deliberate. She stacked them in proper order, a skill that came from training, not from nursing school. She stood and continued toward the medication room without responding, without meeting his eyes, without giving him anything except the satisfaction of physical obedience. The medication room door closed behind her. For exactly 4 seconds, alone in the chemical smell of antiseptic and the soft hum of refrigeration units, her hands trembled. Not from fear. From restraint. From the massive effort of keeping herself compressed into the shape of a nurse, a woman, someone small enough not to be a threat. Her fingers found the challenge coin in her scrub's pocket. The metal was warm from her body heat, tarnished from years of being carried through impossible places. It had been given to her by a Marine colonel in Fallujah in 2007, handed to her after she'd kept his entire squad breathing through an ambush that lasted 47 minutes. The coin was proof of something, of a life she couldn't claim, of skills she couldn't demonstrate, of a person she couldn't be. The trembling stopped. Her hand steadied. She counted her breaths the way she'd been taught, for in, hold for 4, for out. By the time she opened the medication cabinet, she was calm again. The mask was back in place. Her radio crackled. "All units, incoming trauma. Marine Sergeant Major, gunshot wound to the chest. ETA 6 minutes. Trauma Bay 2. The medication room suddenly felt very small. Danielle stood motionless, her hand still on the refrigerator door, the implications of those 7 words cascading through her mind like dominoes. A Marine. Sergeant Major rank. Gunshot wound. That was more than coincidence. That was the kind of statistical impossibility that only happened when someone from her previous life had found her. She closed the medication cabinet carefully and moved toward the door. The trauma bay erupted into controlled chaos as the paramedics wheeled in Sergeant Major Cole Richardson, his marine dress blues already cut away to expose pressure dressings blooming red across his chest. The attending physician, Dr. Patricia Reeves, was already calling out orders: 2 large bore 4s, type O negative blood, get an EKG. Her voice was professional and slightly panicked, the tone of someone who understood that a sergeant major didn't end up in a trauma bay for minor injuries. Danielle moved into position without being asked. Her hands were already gloved, her mind already segmenting the problem into manageable pieces. She established a second for line in 8 seconds flat, her movements the kind of efficient that made Dr. Reeves look up sharply. The way she anchored the needle. The angle of her approach. The absence of hesitation. She was assessing the temporary field dressing with a critical eye, already identifying that the paramedic's technique was competent but not optimal. She reached for a fresh dressing and began to re-establish the temporary closure with a suturing pattern that was too precise, too practiced, too military-medical for a small-town hospital nurse. Across the trauma bay, Petty Officer James Chen, Navy combat medic on a temporary rotation through Cedar Creek, froze mid-compression. His eyes locked on her hands. His hands. The exact way she held the needle holder. The angle of her wrist. The pattern of her stitches. It was the same technique taught at the field hospital in Baghdad, 2nd Battalion Aid Station, 2007. He was looking at her face now. Recognition spreading across his features like sunrise. His voice was quiet, questioning, uncertain. Danielle's eyes met his for exactly 1 second. She gave the smallest shake of her head, a silent plea. Not here. Not now. Don't. Chen's mouth closed. He understood. The sergeant major was stabilizing enough for transport to surgery, and Danielle moved through the documentation with the same unremarkable competence she'd demonstrated 100 times before. Vitals logged. For sites documented. Dressings noted. Just another trauma admission by just another competent nurse. But Chen watched her. He watched the way she moved. He watched the way she anticipated the next step before Dr. Reeves called for it. He watched the way her hands never hesitated, never trembled, never questioned. In the hallway afterward, as Danielle was finishing her charting in the computer alcove, Chen approached carefully. Baghdad. His voice was barely above a whisper. 2007? 2nd Battalion Aid Station. Danielle didn't look up from her keyboard. You're mistaken, petty officer. I've never been to Iraq. But her hand touched the challenge coin in her pocket. The weight of it. The truth of it. The impossible proof of a life that couldn't be discussed in a hospital corridor in Savannah. Chen nodded slowly. Understanding washed over his face, not confusion, but clarity. Recognition of something he'd seen before in other combat medics, other people who'd done impossible things in impossible places and learned to carry them silently. He didn't ask again. He simply turned and walked away, the kind of walk that said he would keep the secret, that he understood what it meant to recognize someone you were never supposed to know. Danielle resumed her charting, her hand steady on the keyboard, her expression completely neutral. But Dr. Whitfield had emerged from the observation window, having watched the entire resuscitation, his eyes narrowed as he studied her. He'd seen something in those 6 minutes that didn't match his narrative. He'd seen a competence that contradicted everything he'd been trying to prove about her. He'd seen a woman whose hands moved like a soldier's hands, like someone trained for something far more serious than bedside manner and documentation. He turned and walked away, and Danielle understood that the stakes had just changed. He would move faster now. He would escalate. He would begin making phone calls and asking pointed questions and building his case against her with the urgency of a man who'd glimpsed something he didn't understand and couldn't tolerate. The paramedics burst through the trauma bay doors with Richardson strapped to a gurney, his combat uniform soaked burgundy from shoulder to waist. The senior paramedic called out vitals like a conductor keeping time, gunshot wound, upper left quadrant, entry and exit, pressure dressings holding for now but he's been bleeding for 40 minutes. The stretcher squeaked against the linoleum as they rolled him deeper into Cedar Creek Medical, the fluorescent lights overhead casting everything in that sterile white that made blood look darker than it actually was. Danielle was folding fresh linens 2 corridors away when she heard the overhead announcement, trauma activation, all hands. She set the stack down with mechanical precision and moved toward the bay, her movements measured, unremarkable, the perfect portrait of a nurse responding to routine emergency protocol. The surgical team materialized like a practiced choreography. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, the attending trauma surgeon, was already scrubbing in, her movements economical and precise. The resident assigned to assessment, a third-year named Chen, was running his hands over Richardson's exposed torso, calling out findings. 2 GSWs, both upper left thorax. The anterior wound is still bleeding actively. Possible hemothorax, possible tension pneumothorax. We need imaging before we know the full scope. Richardson's breathing was shallow, his skin already taking on that waxy pallor that came with volume loss. The monitor showed his heart rate sitting at 142, each beat desperate and rapid, like a fist pounding against a locked door. His blood pressure was dropping, not bottoming out, not yet, but trending toward a place nobody wanted it to go. Danielle stood at the periphery of the trauma bay, her badge catching light from the overhead fixtures. That's when she noticed the Navy combat medic on rotation, Petty Officer Graves, based on the name tape she'd seen in the break room 2 weeks prior, and his head snapped toward her with the kind of recognition that couldn't be faked or masked. His eyes widened by maybe 0.5 millimeter, a flicker of acknowledgement that said, "I know exactly who you are." She was there in the Jolland district in 2005 when a convoy took incoming fire and someone stanched a wound with the kind of surgical precision that belonged on an operating table, not in a Humvee under mortar fire. His jaw tightened as he started to move toward her, but Danielle caught his gaze and gave the subtlest shake of her head, a millimeter of motion, barely visible, but the message crystallized between them, not here, not now, and for God's sake, don't acknowledge it. The acknowledgement landed like a held breath. Graves straightened, gave no indication that anything had passed between them, and returned his attention to Richardson's medical history. He'd understood. Marines understood operational security. They understood that some identities stayed buried until the mission died. Dr. Hoffman made the call. He's going to OR. We need imaging first, CT chest and abdomen, portable X-ray at the bedside, then we go surgical. 2 large bore 4s running wide open, typo negative standing by. Get him upstairs in the next 4 minutes. The surgical team moved with the urgency that came from knowing the mathematics of hemorrhage. Richardson had maybe 30 minutes before blood loss became an irreversible problem, and half of that was already spent. They loaded him onto a fresh stretcher, and the parade moved toward imaging, toward surgery, toward the OR where incisions would be made and damaged tissue would be repaired by hands that had done this 10,000 times before. Danielle returned to the linen closet. Her own hands were steady as she resumed folding, the rhythm of the worker metronome that kept everything compartmentalized. Fold. Stack. Breathe. The tarnished challenge coin was still in her pocket, a weight she'd stopped noticing years ago. It had been a gift from a Marine colonel named Richardson, Daniel Richardson, after a dusty afternoon in Fallujah when she'd spent 6 hours keeping a convoy of soldiers breathing while sandstorms turned visibility to 0 and mortar fire rained down like Old Testament punishment. That was before she was just a nurse. Before she folded linens. Before she became invisible. Richardson made it through surgery. The surgeons repaired the lung tissue, controlled the bleeding, and closed him up with the satisfied precision of people who'd done what they came to do. He was rolled to the ICU at 18:47 hours with vitals holding steady, BP 118/72, heart rate 94, O2 sat 97% on a low oxygen requirement. Stable. Everything stable, which meant for now, he would live. The post-operative orders were routine: monitor vitals every hour, keep the chest tube patent, pain management, antibiotics, observation for infection or complications. No heroics expected. No drama anticipated. Just the standard recovery timeline of a man with money, good genes, and excellent trauma surgery in his favor. Danielle was assigned to the ICU that shift, her name appearing on the board alongside her other patients, a septic pneumonia case in Room 2, a post-op abdominal surgery in Room 4, and Richardson in Room 7, marked as a trauma admission pending stable vitals. She arrived at 1900 hours and began her rounds, reviewing charts, checking drains, documenting the symphony of post-operative care. Richardson was sleeping, his breathing easy, his bandaged chest rising and falling with the kind of rhythm that meant no immediate danger lurked. She spent extra time with his chart, not so much that it would be noticeable, but enough to understand the repair work, left lung tissue damage, vessel ligation, chest tube placement, tetanus update, antibiotics running. Everything that needed to be done had been done. She adjusted his pain medication to account for his weight and Marine baseline tolerance, assuming a man who'd survived gunshot fire could tolerate a higher threshold than the average post-op patient. At 2,300 hours, she was back at the nurse's station charting when Dr. Whitfield appeared like a shadow materializing behind her. His voice was low, pitched for her ears alone, which somehow made it worse than his public humiliations. "G.I. Jane, you're on MedSurg tonight. I want someone with actual critical care experience on my post-op Marines. Richardson needs continuity of care from someone who understands trauma protocols, not a linen folder-playing nurse." The words landed with surgical precision, each one a small incision designed to wound without leaving obvious marks. He wasn't angry. Anger would have been honest. This was calculation dressed up as competence, reassignment wrapped in the language of patient care. Danielle closed her chart and stood, meeting his gaze with the kind of stillness that came from having already survived far worse. "Yes, doctor," she said, her voice the model of professional deference. No argument. No pushback. Just acceptance and a subtle nod that asked nothing and granted everything. The mask stayed in place. She gathered her supplies from the ICU station, transferred her other patients to the night shift coverage, and headed downstairs to MedSurg, where the floors were quieter and the cases less critical and everything felt like being deliberately sidelined. MedSurg was a graveyard shift of routine post-ops and stable admissions. She started her med pass at midnight, moving from room to room with the methodical efficiency of someone who could do this work in a coma. Blood pressure checks, medication administration, wound inspections. Everything by the book. Everything invisible. At 0200 hours, the overhead announcement split the silence like gunfire. Code Blue, ICU Room 7. Code Blue, ICU Room 7. Her entire body went rigid. Room 7. Richardson's room. The one she'd just been yanked away from. The one she wasn't supposed to be monitoring. Her hands froze on the 4-pump she was programming, and for maybe 2 seconds, she let herself feel the weight of what Whitfield had just engineered, removal from the exact patient who'd just become critical. Then the second bell sounded, the call for additional personnel, and Danielle abandoned her med cart. She moved toward the stairwell, her pace accelerating, taking the concrete steps 3 at a time. Her shoes made a rhythm against the metal treads, thud, thud, thud. Her heartbeat matched the tempo. The code team would be responding, but the ICU was on the 3rd floor and she was already in the stairwell, already moving, already deciding that protocols and assignments and Whitfield's carefully constructed sabotage were less important than a Marine who trusted her with recognition and stayed silent about it. She hit the 3rd floor landing and burst into the ICU hallway. The door to room 7 was open, the alarm bell still ringing from the monitor, and the scene that met her was chaos that hadn't yet become panic but was sliding toward it. The on-call resident, Dr. Marcus Chen, the same one who'd assessed Richardson in the trauma bay, was standing frozen beside the crash cart, his hands shaking as he stared at the monitor. Richardson's rhythm had gone from sinus to V-fib, the jagged electrical storm of cardiac arrest, his heart quivering uselessly in his chest instead of pumping blood. The code team hadn't arrived yet. The hallway was empty except for Chen and 2 ICU nurses who were already beginning compressions on Richardson's chest. "He was stable," Chen was saying, his voice cracking. "He was stable. I checked him 40 minutes ago. How is he?" his hands hovered over the crash cart like they belonged to someone else, like he was watching himself from outside his own body. Danielle assessed in 2 seconds. Richardson's chart was at the bedside, she'd just reviewed it. No obvious trigger. No fever, no respiratory distress, no change in drain output. But his pupils were blown, fixed and dilated, and there was a darkness around his eyes that spoke of something catastrophic happening inside his chest. Cardiac tamponade. Blood filling the pericardial sac from internal bleeding, compressing his heart until it couldn't beat effectively anymore. The kind of complication that developed when surgical repair wasn't quite perfect, or when the human body decided post-operative perfection wasn't enough. 90 seconds. Maybe less. That was how long Richardson had before brain death became inevitable. "Stop compressions," Danielle said. Her voice had dropped an octave, the timbre shifting into something that carried command authority without needing volume. The nurses stopped immediately, their hands releasing Richardson's chest. "Get me a scalpel kit, 14-gauge angiocath, and prep his left anterior chest wall." "I'm the attending on call," Chen said, but his voice wavered at the edges. "I need to." "You need to step back and let me work, doctor." Not a request. Not even phrased as a question. The voice of someone who'd done this in a sandstorm under mortar fire in Baghdad, someone who'd kept a convoy of soldiers breathing with nothing but field expedient equipment and 3 years of surgical training that nobody here knew she possessed. Her hand reached for the scalpel kit as one of the ICU nurses pressed it into her palm. The metal was cold, familiar, an old friend. She didn't hesitate. This was muscle memory. This was the kind of decision that made careers explode and covers evaporate, but Richardson was coding and she'd already made her choice. Her hand moved to his anterior chest wall, palpating the landmarks, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, and she made the incision with one swift motion. The scalpel hissed through skin, and everything changed forever. The monitor flatlined. One long electronic shriek that turned the ICU silent except for the ventilator's mechanical wheeze. Sergeant Major Richardson's chest stopped moving. His pupils dilated. The resident froze, coffee cup suspended halfway to his mouth, his brain refusing to execute commands his training had drilled into him 1,000 times. Danielle moved. She didn't run. She didn't call out. She walked into Richardson's room with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst, her hands reaching for the crash cart before anyone else remembered how to think. The attending was 3 floors down. The code team was 90 seconds out. Richardson had 90 seconds before permanent neurological damage began, and Danielle's hands knew things that most nurses spent entire careers never learning. She tore open his post-operative dressing with practiced efficiency, the sterile field irrelevant now. The sutures she'd placed 6 hours earlier tore free under her fingers. She reached for the surgical tray beside his bed, the one kept in ICU for precisely this kind of emergency, and her hands moved like they were operating on muscle memory from Baghdad, from a sandstorm that had turned the world orange and angry while rounds snapped overhead. "Scalpel," she said. The resident didn't move. She took it herself from the tray, her fingers locating the landmarks on Richardson's anterior chest wall with the precision of someone who'd done this in worse light, under worse circumstances, with worse odds. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She made the incision in one swift motion, and the scalpel parted skin and muscle like she was opening an envelope, blood welling up dark and immediate. Rib spreader. The same resident fumbled for it, his hand shaking in a way that made clear he'd never actually done this. Never watched a chest open in real time. Never felt a human heart stop beneath his own fingers. Danielle took the spreader, positioned it, and leveraged Richardson's ribs apart with steady force. The bone cracked slightly, a sound like driftwood under weight, and the pericardial sac came into view, tense and dark with blood that shouldn't have been there. She opened it without hesitation. Blood evacuated. The chamber cleared. Richardson's heart lay exposed, still as a stone, and Danielle's right hand slipped into the cavity, her fingers finding the apex, and she began direct cardiac massage with rhythm that was almost meditative. Compress. Release. Compress. Release. Her thumb and fingers worked the ventricles with the kind of precision that only comes from having done this before, when the stakes were not in a hospital but in a convoy truck with gunfire hammering the steel above her head. Epi. 1 milligram 4. Now. A nurse scrambled. The medication went in. Danielle kept working. Her other hand maintained the compression for minutes of sustained, unbroken rhythm while the resident watched like he was witnessing something that shouldn't be possible. The heart didn't respond immediately. That was normal. That was data. Pain was information, and the body's resistance was just another piece of intelligence to read. Petty Officer Chen appeared in the ICU doorway. His eyes found hers for exactly 1 second, and in that second his entire face changed. Recognition. Confirmation. He already suspected. Now he knew. She was performing open cardiac massage on a Marine Sergeant Major at 0200 hours in an ICU, and her hands were steady as surgical lasers, and Chen was looking at a woman he'd only ever known as a quiet nurse folding linens in supply rooms. The monitor began to spike. First a small rhythm disturbance. Then a fuller beat. Then another. The heart was catching, responding, the muscle remembering how to contract under the direct stimulus of her fingers. Danielle felt it, the sudden firmness, the electric response, and she knew before the monitor confirmed it. The rhythm steadied. Beeping returned. Steady. Consistent. Sinus rhythm restored. She withdrew her hand and began closing with sutures pulled from memory and muscle, her fingers working the needle through tissue with stitches that would hold, that would endure, that would outlast everything else that was about to happen. The resident was pale. A nurse was crying silently. An attending from another unit had rushed in and was now standing frozen, watching a suspension nurse perform emergency thoracotomy like she was on a battlefield instead of in a climate-controlled hospital surrounded by administrators who'd never had to choose between protocol and survival. For medical witnesses. All of them watching. All of them understanding that something had just happened that didn't fit inside the normal world. By 0800 hours, Dr. Marcus Whitfield had already picked up his phone. The first call went to board member Sterling, his voice smooth and concerned. "We have a serious liability issue. That nurse from ICU performed an authorized surgery on Sergeant Major Richardson. Direct cardiac massage without surgeon presence. Massive institutional exposure. We need immediate action." The second call went to board member Hayes. Then board member Conrad. Each conversation was a small masterpiece of strategic concern, each one calibrated to sound like he was protecting the hospital when really he was protecting himself, because if Danielle's competence was genuine, if she really was performing complex emergency procedures with that level of precision, then what did that say about the cases Whitfield had saved when he was present? What did that say about his necessity? Her fabricated references began receiving calls by noon. Just verifying some details about her background. Any gaps in her credentials? Any concerns during her tenure? The investigator Whitfield brought in was expensive and thorough, and the assignment was vague but clear: find something. Anything. A discrepancy in dates. A credential that didn't match. A reference that couldn't verify employment. Find a crack and the entire cover would shatter. They found the crack by 1400 hours. Her credentials from her previous assignment in San Diego, the Navy hospital where she'd supposedly worked for 2 years, had records that were impeccable on the surface but oddly difficult to verify directly. The investigator raised the flag. Whitfield seized on it. By 1600 hours, he was on the phone with the hospital credentialing committee. "We have serious concerns about credential verification. I'm recommending immediate suspension pending full investigation." By 1800 hours on a day that had started with her saving a man's life, Danielle was called to the Human Resources office. The director was a woman named Patricia who'd always been kind, who brought baked goods to the staff meetings, and who now wouldn't meet Danielle's eyes. "We've received notification of credentialing irregularities in your background. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending a full review of your credentials. You'll need to return your badge and your scrubs." Danielle's jaw tightened for exactly 1 second, the only visible indication that she'd understood what was really happening, and then her expression returned to the calm professionalism that had become her armor. "I understand. You'll be contacted within 2 weeks about the outcome of the investigation." "Yes, ma'am." She returned her badge, turned in her scrubs, walked out of Cedar Creek Medical through the staff entrance, not through the main lobby where Whitfield could watch her leave in shame. The intelligence mission she'd been running for 6 months was finished. The pharmaceutical trafficking network she'd been monitoring through the hospital's supply chain operations, the network that had been moving opioids and fentanyl at a volume that suggested cartel involvement, was now buried under Whitfield's sabotage. Months of work. Months of careful documentation. Months of playing the role of an invisible woman folding linens and drawing blood and maintaining the perfect mask of a nurse with no history and no past. All of it compromised because a man was more afraid of being irrelevant than he was willing to tolerate a woman who was competent. The hospital laundry room was empty at 2100 hours. The industrial washers hummed their mechanical song, a rhythmic throb like a heartbeat that wouldn't stop. Danielle sat on the edge of the folding table and began to fold her scrubs, the ones she'd turned in the next size up so she could move freely, the ones that had never quite fit the woman she really was. Blue. White. Blue. White. The repetition was meditative, the kind of task that small hands and larger minds could do simultaneously. The challenge coin was still in her pocket. It was tarnished now, the edges worn smooth from 18 years of being carried from Baghdad to Helmand Province to a dozen forward operating bases where names were classified and dates were buried, and the only thing that remained was the weight of a coin that weighed almost nothing. Colonel Marcus Hayes had pressed it into her hand outside Fallujah, in a moment when she'd just brought his radio man back from the dead, and he'd said only, "This is so you remember you're not alone out here." She wasn't alone. She'd never been alone, not really. The Navy had a way of making sure of that. And now the Navy would know what happened in Savannah, because Sergeant Major Richardson was already calling his command, already reporting that the nurse who'd saved his life was no longer employed, already describing the pattern of harassment that had driven her out, already doing the thing that brothers do when one of their own has been targeted. The coin slipped from her pocket and clattered onto the concrete floor of the laundry room. It spun. Once. Twice. 3 times. Then it stopped, heads facing up, right next to the industrial washers that kept running, indifferent to the falling of heroes, indifferent to the failing of cover, indifferent to the weight that was suddenly pressing down on a woman who had carried it alone for so long. She picked up the coin. Held it. Looked at the face stamped on its surface, the insignia of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. The unit that had needed her in Baghdad. The unit that was about to need her now. Danielle pocketed the coin and walked out through the service entrance, not looking back toward Whitfield's office on the 3rd floor, toward the man who was still smiling at his desk, believing he'd won. The following morning, every monitor in Cedar Creek Medical switched to the same image simultaneously. News anchors across 3 networks led with breaking coverage, the Navy press release, a photograph in dress whites, ribbons arranged like a map of sacrifice across a chest that had been folding linens in a supply room 48 hours earlier. Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross. Navy Cross. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. The photograph held her name in white letters beneath her face, a face the staff had seen every day and never truly seen at all. Dr. Whitfield stood in the lobby with 3 board members, mid-sentence about maintaining standards, when a nurse pointed at the nearest screen. His words stopped. His mouth stayed open, the sentence dying like a patient losing pulse. The board members turned toward him with expressions that shifted from confusion to understanding to something colder, the look of people calculating what his actions meant now that they knew who he'd been breaking. The sergeant major made 1 phone call from his recovery room. That was all. 1 call, and the elevator doors opened to admit a Navy rear admiral flanked by 2 NCIS agents, their badges clipped to suits that fit like they were tailored for authority itself. The admiral's presence changed the air pressure in the lobby the way a storm front changes it before the lightning, a tangible shift in the weight of everything. Whitfield's face went the color of the walls behind him. Dr. Marcus Whitfield. The Admiral's voice moved like cold water through the space. Yes, Admiral. Whitfield's hand reached for the nearest board member's shoulder. The board member stepped away, creating a small island of distance around him. Your consulting privileges at this facility are hereby revoked, effective immediately, by order of the Secretary of the Navy under provisions of the Defense Healthcare Network Agreement Cedar Creek Medical signed in 2019. The Admiral handed a document to the hospital CEO, who skimmed it. His face went pale. His jaw clenched. He turned to Whitfield with eyes that had already written the ending. "Marcus, you are terminated. Security will escort you out." The CEO's voice was measured, professional, final. Whitfield's mouth opened and closed like a fish on dry tile. "You can't, I have board connections, I was protecting hospital standards." 3 board members physically stepped away from him, creating visible distance. One muttered something into his phone. Another examined his shoes. The third simply turned his back. Dr. Whitfield, the lead NCIS agent, stepped forward. "We need to discuss your communications with several individuals currently under federal investigation for pharmaceutical diversion. You contacted them yesterday regarding a problem nurse. Those individuals are part of the trafficking network Master Chief Ross was monitoring. Your interference compromised an active operation. You may have just handed us 30 days of investigative work and potentially endangered ongoing surveillance in 3 states. Whitfield's face cycled through colors, red to white to a shade of gray that suggested his body was shutting down in real time. "I didn't know, I was just trying to, I thought she was." Security arrived. Earl, the Vietnam veteran who'd straightened to attention when he heard Nightingale's operational code name crackle over the radio, personally escorted Whitfield toward the exit. Whitfield passed a nurse he'd made cry in the medication room, a respiratory therapist he'd publicly berated for a charting error, a junior doctor he'd threatened with dismissal. The nurse whispered, "Goodbye, sir," and the smile on her face made it clear that goodbye was the kindest thing she was offering. The Admiral personally waited in the lobby for Danielle. She emerged from the stairwell in fresh scrubs, and the room recognizes the shift before anyone could articulate it. The way she moved was different now. No apologies in her posture. No attempt to be invisible. The challenge coin was clipped openly to her badge where everyone could see it. The Admiral extended a new credential, her name spelled out in full rank. Master Chief Petty Officer Ross. "Welcome back to active duty. You did good work here." He said it the way senior officers speak to junior ones who've just survived something most people can't imagine. There was weight in his voice, the kind earned in command centers and forward operating bases. Danielle accepted the credential with a single nod. Petty Officer Chen, the Navy combat medic, saluted her, a proper, full salute, his hand rising to his temple with precision. She returned it, and somewhere in the crowd of staff members, someone started clapping. The applause built like an incoming tide, filling the lobby with sound. Danielle simply turned toward the elevator, back to work, as if Navy admirals arrived to reinstate hidden operatives every Tuesday. The moment seemed to exhaust her patience for being watched. She pressed the button. The doors closed. The applause continued in her absence. But that wasn't the worst part for Whitfield. 6 months later, a nurse leaving her shift at Cedar Creek spotted him through the window of a strip mall between a vape shop and a tax preparation franchise. He was sitting at a folding table with a laptop and a stack of pamphlets, selling supplemental insurance to whoever walked past. No medical credential on display. No title. No board position or hospital letterhead. Just a folding table and the kind of desperation that comes from losing everything that kept you standing. Danielle returned to Cedar Creek Medical the next day in fresh scrubs, moving through the hallways with the same methodical precision she'd always used, but with something fundamentally altered in how staff responded to her presence. Her intelligence work resumed immediately, now operating openly with full hospital cooperation and security clearances processed through official channels. The pharmaceutical trafficking network unraveled within 3 weeks. 7 arrests. 2 hospital staff members who'd been feeding supply chain information to outside distributors for $8,000 a month. The Navy followed the money to a wholesaler in Atlanta, then to a distribution cell operating across 4 states. It was the work she'd been building toward when Whitfield's sabotage had nearly ended everything. In the ICU, she checked on Sergeant Major Richardson during his final day before discharge. He was sitting up in bed, his daughter's photograph spread across the bedside table like a map of the life he was returning to. His shoulder had healed. His wound was clean. His eyes were sharp again. "Master Chief," he said quietly when she entered, no longer the urgent whisper of shared secrets but the relaxed acknowledgement of 2 soldiers who'd fought in the same war and survived to tell about it. "Semper Fi," she responded, and the words meant everything. They meant the mission, the sacrifice, the code that bound them across years and continents. He offered a single nod. She returned it with the ghost of a smile, 2 warriors who'd kept each other's secrets until the moment those secrets became weapons. Richardson gestured to the challenge coin clipped to her badge, catching the light like something precious. "Fallujah?" he asked. "Colonel Martinez." He made it home. She said it the way soldiers speak, past tense acknowledging present grace, the names of the dead honoring the living. "Because of you." She didn't confirm or deny, just adjusted his full line with practiced efficiency and checked his vitals one final time. Everything stable. Everything healing. Everything as it should be. The hospital ran differently now. The hierarchy felt less rigid. Staff members spoke up when they saw problems instead of staying silent. A new resident asked Danielle to demonstrate the suturing technique she'd used on Richardson, the one they'd all heard about through the invisible network that connects medical professionals. She taught him patiently, explaining the field modifications that save seconds when seconds mean the difference between a heartbeat and a flat line. He listened like she was speaking a language he'd been searching for his entire career. In the hallway, she passed Earl, the security guard. He stood a bit straighter when she approached, and she slowed her pace slightly, a small acknowledgement. "At ease, sailor," she said softly. He grinned, and for a moment he wasn't an elderly security guard at a Savannah hospital. He was a soldier again, someone who understood what it meant to see through the masks people wore. "Welcome home, Master Chief." A week later, Danielle paused at the memorial wall in Cedar Creek's lobby where the hospital honored its veterans. Someone had added her photograph in dress whites, her commendations listed below in small print. Navy Cross. Silver Star. Purple Heart, twice. The challenge coin hung on a ribbon beneath the frame, not her actual coin, but a replica that someone had commissioned, understanding that the original would never leave her. She touched the challenge coin on her badge, the real one, the one that had been with her through Baghdad and the years after and the days pretending to be ordinary. Then she walked out through the emergency department exit into the Savannah evening. The parking lot smelled like rain coming, like the air before a storm when the pressure drops and everything goes quiet. She drove toward the waterfront where the sun was finishing its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange that looked like fire and looked like hope. The radio played something soft, something that didn't require her attention. Behind her, Cedar Creek Medical had already returned to its rhythm. Patients arrived. Nurses moved. Doctors made decisions. The machinery of healing continued without her, which was exactly as it should be. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. If you made it this far, you already know why Danielle kept folding those linens, why she accepted the humiliation, why she never broke. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet warriors among us, the ones operating in silence, the ones you'll never recognize until the moment everything changes. Like and comment if you'd have made the same choice. Because sometimes the bravest decision is the one nobody ever sees.